Alright, so between this weekend's movies, last weekend's movies, VOD, and Netflix, we're dealing with 6 movies this week. So let's just do that. We're gonna start with Shazam, which is a movie that I probably I don't know that I wasn't necessarily not giving it a fair shot, but I kind of just didn't have expectations for it at all because Shazam is not a hero I'm familiar with at all. Like I wasn't even aware of like his concept until like late into this movie's advertising run. And then once I heard that and how it's kind of the basically if Big was a superhero movie thing, it did become interesting, but there was something kind of lingering in my mind. But once again, only briefly, where it was like, oh, it's a funny superhero. And it's like, as you know, it didn't take Deadpool long to wear thin on me, so now this whole concept was kind of just like, I don't really know. But in defense of movies like Deadpool, or like the way I defended the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, it does feel like it's a whole different thing when it's your superhero movies maybe have too much comic relief in them versus your superhero movie actually being able to be classified as a comedy to a certain extent. So I wasn't gonna necessarily hold that against it, even though it was kind of in the back of my head of is this gonna be played out or not. It really just depended on the execution, and I thought this was executed quite well for the most part, despite the somewhat dark opening. Where we get our supervillain origin story to start off with, interestingly enough. And that sort of thing, how we know that our main hero is going to be an actual child just in an adult's body from time to time. It seems kind of appropriate to start with our supervillain as a child and see exactly how we got there. And obviously he ends up finding his way to Jaimin Hansu. And this immediately caught my attention that this is now the third comic book movie with Jaimin Hansu in like less than 5 months, which is interesting. But yeah, even though I think it helped a lot that like I really had no connection to this story or these characters at all, like going in. But at the same time, it was one of those things where like when big certain things were revealed, it was kind of like I had no idea what it was or what its significance was, but I was able to put together. That's probably a big deal if I was familiar with the comics and everything else about this hero. But so that it was actually kind of nice to still kind of be able to identify those things, even if I have no idea their entire significance. So there is that, I guess. But you've got this whole story going in because it's like maybe 40 minutes before we see Zachary Levi's face. So there's a lot of importance given to the characters before we go into all that, particularly with Billy being a foster kid, which kind of sounds like it's setting up a whole bunch of cliches. And that's not to say that the cliches aren't in here, but like a lot of these characters are just kind of instantly lovable enough that it doesn't really matter. Especially the foster parents, especially the foster dad, and all those characters, and obviously Jack Dylan Grazer from he played Eddie in It. Basically, this is him getting his chance to play Richie now. But still, the back and forth between him and Billy and how it goes from the two of them being kids to him being Shazam, I guess you could say. There is like it's weird to say this so many times watching a superhero movie, but it's like the big comparisons are pretty inevitable, all the way down to the whole friendship storyline and how when he gets too much into being the adult side of himself and the benefits that come from that, it's gonna strain their more childlike friendship and all that. It's to the point that there's even the moment when he and Mark Strong are fighting, and then the piano on the floor comes into play. I do like that they had the restraint to not play like Heart and Soul or Chopsticks or whatever. Just like, I guess also because Superman Returns is already a DC movie that gave us Heart and Soul in it, so there's that. So yeah, I did like that there were those references though, even because I'm talking about restraining references. But when it comes to the actual universe, I wasn't quite sure exactly how they were going about it, since they're basically kind of in the midst of like a half reboot sort of thing in regards to the DC universe. I like we're keeping some of it, but the rest of it we're gonna like completely change, and maybe forget some stuff happened. So I wasn't quite sure where we were when we saw the battering in Freddy, I think his name was, his room. And it's like, oh, okay, so they are still in the universe. It's just they have like the whole merchandising and other thing. I can't remember if the universe has gone into that yet with those characters, but it's definitely here now, which I thought was a really interesting aspect. And they kind of go into that also in the second post-credit scene, humorous way. So yeah, all that stuff I actually did really like, where it was like they are doing like the whole universe building thing and kind of keeping it in that area, but not like it's not like the stories need to be connected, and it doesn't have that hanging over its head, which I really liked also. And the fact that they use it more for fun than we have to put a universe together sort of thing made it a lot more enjoyable in that aspect in regards to building a universe with it. So I really liked how they handled that. Um, as far as like effects go, those are for the most part really well done. Also, particularly this the point in time when they really could have failed would be Mark Strong's like monsters, whatever they are. They get to perform a boardroom massacre that is pretty much on the level of the boardroom massacres in RoboCop or Dogma, and a really sort of like they're memorable on the same level. Like that's almost shockingly brutal scene when the first attack happens out the window. I was kind of shocked by how genuine the people in the room reacted to this, and it's like for a movie that's having so much fun with itself, those moments like have all the more potency when they happen, because there's just the right amount of balance with it. It doesn't feel like it's a drastic change. I think another reason it doesn't feel like a drastic change when the scenes get that dark is the fact that we opened the movie the way that we did. So that was really well done in that sense, and kind of we eased into the comedy instead of the comedy trying to ease into some of the darker aspects of it, which was the way to go for sure. I haven't mentioned David Sandberg's name yet, who's the director, who obviously has been known for horror movies. I'm hoping I'm not getting people mixed up here. I'm pretty sure he is the Lights Out and Annabelle creation guy, which is really interesting because it's like seeing this the same night as Pet Sematary. It's like going to the movie theater and seeing, you know, a David Sandberg movie and seeing, you know, a horror movie, and they aren't the same movie. They're two different ones. But still, you would never really. But yeah, scenes like that where they go into the more, you know, the darker aspects of it, you can kind of see where it's that same director, but that he can transition from those like seriously dark movies to this movie that's so lighthearted with just every now and then a dark little aspect to it. Yeah, it's I love how much he was able to find that balance, but you can just tell watching his horror movies how damn talented he is, and the fact that he can carry that over into other genres we now know is really exciting for his career. So I'm really kind of psyched to see what else he can do, because I feel like he's gonna have a lengthy career that people are really gonna love for the most part, as long as he keeps it up. Um, so we've got stuff also like as far as effects go. Sometimes stuff that's just, you know, simple and not necessarily something that is new, but like when we see Mark Strong walk through the doorway and the way the camera pans around, and we see that it's like we see him walking into the other place, but then as it pans around, it's just him walking through an empty door frame that he is no longer in. That shot kind of stood out as a really nice effect also. Um, and then every now and then there's just stuff in there that's like just these little touches that work really well. Like there's at first I was wondering how much we were going to do the flashback thing, especially since we started with something that was at a time before all this. But the main little subplot here with him looking for his mom and having that memory of when she lost him. And the thing here is like that particular moment where we see like the altered flashback, where like we see the flashback in one sense, and then after certain things come to light, he has the same flashback, but it's more kind of we realized that the first time we saw it was kind of a glamorized version that his, when he was very, very young, had put in his head, and now that he's putting the pieces together and learning more, and we kind of see it for what it really was, and it wasn't quite as glamorous, but the only way they show that is through the way his mom says, like, one line. And I thought that was really well done also, and something that's not too, that makes a big impact without having to be really showy about it, which I really liked. And yeah, as far as, being pretty much a comedy as far as it goes, yeah, it helps a lot that it's actually really funny, because obviously when you're like sort of just doing comedy relief in a movie that's overall trying to be serious, it's really easy to fall flat. But the fact that it's kind of so consistent with itself, and the fact that it can stay funny throughout, like I said, even if it's stuff that we've seen before, the execution is all, it just puts it all together nicely. And stuff like even like action scenes that shouldn't be laughed at, but I was laughing into them. Like the whole bus scene in any other movie would have been like the break where we get the big action scene where the hero does something really big and heroic for the first time. But for the entire first half of the bus scene, I was still laughing because of the fact that this big, serious bus scene of him trying to stop him from falling off the bridge only happened because he was dicking off. And he gets scolded for that, but yeah, but the balance that the scene actually does work, as a bit. I mean, action scene may be overdoing it a little bit because he just basically has to lower it, but still, it has that certain appeal to it, and it's somehow not watered down by the fact that it more or less starts with a laugh, depending on the person, I guess. But I guess I'm one of those people. Um, but no, a lot of it just really it worked for me overall, and I was really like I was a little concerned at first about its runtime. I never felt that runtime. It says 2 hours and 12 minutes. I kind of kept looking at my watch to make sure that was even true because it just had such a nice flow to it. Uh, so yeah, I do really like this a lot. Even though, like I said, there'll be some scenes that are familiar, like the whole testing montage. Probably bring memories back of the first Iron Man when he's testing out the suit, and there's the whole thing about Jack Dylan Grazer's character trying to convince the people that are bullying him at school that he's friends with Zachary Levi, and he can come in and be the big person and make him really popular and all that. It's the exact same subplot in Spider-Man: Homecoming when Peter didn't get to the party in time and all that. So yeah, and then that's basically where it really starts to turn into the plot of Big, more or less. Just him being a superhero instead of working at a toy company, but basically the same thing. And a supervillain. John Hurd didn't get quite as extreme as Mark Strong, of course, but yeah, that's another hilarious scene also where they kind of do the whole turning expectations in regards to movies like this on their heads, where it's Mark Strong monologuing, but he's too far away for anybody to hear him. That's fucking hilarious. So, yeah, that's pretty much all I really have to say specifically. And obviously, Zachary Levi is very good, and as far as this character goes, like, because he was one of those people where somebody asked me the other day if I like him in general, and I realized that I didn't really have enough to go on to answer that I could remember. Because I didn't watch, Chuck or anything, and I only saw him in, like, whichever one of the Thor movies he was in. Because they kept, like, they recast those roles. I can't remember which one he was actually in, but yeah, but this is the first time he's kind of, like, really, really made an impression. And it's a really great impression, so it's all good. And also, like, in regards to Mark Strong playing the villain, that's another thing that seemed like it was kind of really played out in kind of a boring choice, because I wasn't sure I was so blind going into this. I didn't even know, like, who the villain... I don't recall knowing Mark Strong was in it going in, nor the fact that he was the villain, because I didn't know, like, who the villain was at all, because there was the whole Dwayne Johnson thing when this was in, like, pre-production, but then obviously that changed and morphed until it was finally this, despite the fact that Dwayne Johnson does have an executive producer credit. Yeah, and that end credits animation is really great too. So yeah, I really like this pretty much through and through. Like, I'm kind of struggling to find something to say that's negative about it, apart from, oh, we've seen some of it before, but fuck it. So, speaking of stuff that we have seen before, though, we can talk about Pet Sematary. Before we go into it, I should probably mention, obviously, like probably most people talking about this, a lot of it's probably going to be comparisons to the original. I know, but the thing is that the original movie like has this following. I don't know that I ever would have expected, because I watched it like forever ago for the first time I saw it, and it was just like, yeah, that's a Stephen King adaptation if I've ever seen one. For better and worse, it's got both. But then it's just like, and that's a movie that exists at the end. But the original movie has like a really massive and passionate fan base apparently. Like people that like really consider it a quintessential horror movie and know it front to back. So I'm not one of those people at all. I'm going into this one just as somebody saying it's fine. There are certain things about it that are like really eerie and creepy, but there's also a lot of stuff that's really silly in it, and I kind of came away from it remembering the silly stuff a lot more than I remember the more genuinely creepy stuff. So it seemed like there was room to do a remake that was maybe a bit darker, or maybe cut out the silly stuff and maybe change something here and there. So I was interested to find that for the most part, I mean, obviously there is at least one or two drastic changes, but even with those drastic changes in place, most of the original movie is here, like all the way down to some dialogue and the way everything feels. They're really, really damn close. So but it does open in the fashion that so many horror movies do of a family driving to a new house. Even with, I guess because it's so fresh in my mind, but even with some of the shots feeling like almost the exact same shots, as they were driving to the house, I kept waiting for Jason Clarke to turn the radio on to I Got Five on it. But regardless of that, once they get there, yeah, there is the whole setup where we set up the whole speeding semi trucks thing, and we've got the procession, which is new. At least my memory of the book is so damn vague. I don't even know if I can make references to it. So as far as like comparing to the original movie, the procession thing is new, and it's something that I could see people finding a bit, I guess, dumb. Especially since we only really see it like it seems like this thing that could be this continuous thing that's like really genuinely creepy, but it's just that one time. It never really comes back except for the masks. But it did feel like there was something kind of creepy about it to me. Like it kind of felt like a children's version of the Wicker Man is like what they had just walked out of, and then with the fog there and everything, and so there was something to that, and I think that's kind of why I'm kind of put off by it. It's like they didn't kind of use it to their advantage a little more because I feel like they could have. But still, as just this standalone scene that introduces the creepiness of the atmosphere of this place they've just moved to, it works. It might seem a little overbearing being as early as it is. It's like just how very quickly they get blatant clues. Hey, this place is evil. You probably shouldn't be here, but you're gonna stay anyway because it's a horror movie. Um, but still, as far as setting the tone, I think it works. And then there's the whole thing where, like, when they go into the cemetery the first time and Judd's taking him over to the other side of the pet cemetery, I do like, because in the original movie that scene is in the daylight, if I remember correctly. And this one, which is nice and different for a horror movie, but there's really something about the portrayal in this one where it is in the dark when you'd expect it to be. But when they're going through the woods, it's like when we get these massive shots, it's like the woods feel otherworldly huge in this really disturbing way, where it feels like if they keep walking, they're just going to be in endless dark fog and woods forever, for all eternity, which is like really overwhelming in this really great way in regards to building like the tension and the horror of it. So you see, yeah, I really love the stuff like that. And obviously there's going to be some sort of character changes here, but mainly with Judd's character, who is John Lithgow now, who is a great casting choice. Like, it's one of those times where, like, you hear about, a horror movie coming out, most of the time a remake, and you're like, oh, they're doing that, are they? But then you hear, like, one name in the cast list, and you're like, okay, there's got to be something good about this then. And John Lithgow is that person. Jason Clarke is great too, but John Lithgow gives you, like, a whole other level of, okay, there's got to be something good about this. And what's interesting is Lithgow has played, like, a really nice, warm presence so many times. It's interesting that when Fred Gwynne played him in the '89 version, that there was, like, a warmth to him sort of immediately. And there was something kind of inviting about him, even though he had all the sinister knowledge. But there is something that's, like, a bit more... I think aggressive is kind of a hard word, but it's, like, the only one that comes to mind. And at least when you're comparing the two. And there's something more, like... You definitely much more get this guy has seen some shit vibe from Lithgow's performance. But I like the fact that like both those performances work. Like, it's not necessarily a character that works better either when he's a warmer presence or when he's a more, sort of a crazy Ralph Friday the 13th scenario. But both of them do kind of work, and I do like that they sort of let an actor like Lithgow just kind of have it, instead of saying you've got to kind of do it this particular way because this is the one particular way we want the character and the character should stay this way. The fact that we kind of got a bit of a different version of him and that Lithgow got to do more stuff with that was more his own, I think still works in the context of what we have here. So, especially, there are some moments though that I do kind of miss, like, when we get that scene when, in the original, when Ellie's freaking out about the cemetery, and he, like, kind of calmly explains why cemeteries are a good place, basically. That scene's not in this one. And I guess it kind of would have seemed out of place with the vibes his character brings off now, but I do still think some scenes like that worked really well, so they are kind of missed here a little bit, but, we can move on. As far as, being a remake and having the scenes that we expect in it, I like that they took it, like, usually, remakes sort of bask in the idea of having the same scenes and just kind of running with them and being able to basically cash in on the idea of, well, these scenes already worked before, so if we just redo them slightly, they'll still have the same effect. Which obviously doesn't often actually work, no matter how much studios think it might. But this one, like, really takes joy in, like, the fact that they know the original movie's going to be in your head, so they, like, fuck with the expectations, like, all the time. Which is really nice, because a lot of the times, like I was saying, the movie's pretty much the same movie. But there are those moments where you can tell they're intentionally fucking with the audience, knowing what is in the audience's minds already, and knowing they can go in a different direction if they really want to. It's sometimes just small things, like, the scene with, Victor in the hospital, where in the original movie, he just, like, grabbed his arm, but in this one, it's the whole thing where he walks away for a minute, and when he comes back, he's just, like, sitting up all the way, which is something we don't quite expect, because the whole just grabbing his arm thing is what's in our heads. So I like that they kind of messed around with that a little bit, because you've got also, we're expecting, the Achilles scene at one point. So we get, like, one shot of it that we're almost certain is the shot because it's in the same location that it was in the original movie. And it ends up just being a tease. And the actual moment is, like, 30 seconds later. And it's, like, even though it's, like, you can tell they're doing it, and that maybe that can take you out of it if you can see them working what they're doing behind the scenes too much. But I kind of like how you can actually see them having fun with playing with the audience's expectations because it's aware that it's a remake, and if they just tweak something just a tiny little bit, there's still that element of surprise, even though we know it's coming, just not at the time we think it is. So, yeah, I can appreciate that. But then there's stuff like the big change, which I will go, like, if by some miracle you don't know what the big change is, you may want to stop listening after a while, because I'm going to kind of go into that, but even even somebody like me that like avoids all trailers and all that stuff, it still got back to me what the big change was before I saw it. So it's like they wanted people to be that aware, even though there was the whole thing. But once again, that's another case where it sets up like it's going to do exactly what the original did, and then there's just the turn, but it ends up being like the biggest turn in the movie, just in that totally different direction. Um, and then you've got the whole Zelda thing, which in a way they expand on, but in a way they kind of take away from also. What I did really like about it was, once again, I can't remember if this is a book thing or not. I have no idea, but the whole thing about her hearing Zelda in the walls, and the whole dumbwaiter thing, is obviously new if you're just going off the movie, the original movie. And what I love about this is that even if that's not in the book, and we know it's not in the original movie, the whole idea of having her like die in the walls and then like it, so even though she saw her body removed, she can still like it haunts her, like she can hear her in the walls, that is such a Stephen King thing. It's like that totally feels like something that's out of his mind. So I really love that also, and the way they sort of use the flashbacks in kind of a better way than the other movie did, which was where her Zelda flashbacks, if I remember correctly, were just kind of at random. And that's pretty much the way they are here also, because it's just something that never goes away. But there's that one moment when he's talking about having found Church's body, and he's saying it looked twisted, and just him saying the word twisted, like just for a second, snaps an image of Zelda's body in her mind and then goes away. Like that's really effective, and that's an effective way to show that, the memory is constantly with her and never leaves, and there's always just those tiny little things that can trigger it at any moment. That I think works a lot more effectively than just like having them happen and kind of a break in the story. So yeah, and then like I was saying, there's I mean, it's a dark ass movie like all the way, and it's trying to be as bleak as it possibly can. Um, but the ending itself being another one of those big changes. But every now and then you can see it having a sense of humor about itself. Like you can, I mean, like I said, you can sense maybe a bit of a sense of humor in the way they fuck with the audience's expectations in those moments I was talking about, particularly the Achilles fake out. But there are actual genuine moments like. Well, one is like, one line delivery of when, Church comes back and she doesn't know what's happened, so she just says, it's a good thing you're not a fucking vet, because he is a doctor, which is funny. But then there's stuff where you can just tell somebody is like snickering behind the camera, because at the beginning, when Ellie's watching SpongeBob, if you know the episode well enough, you realize that's the episode where SpongeBob and Patrick think that Squidward has come back from the dead. Inserting that is a nice touch also. So now as far as I was talking about the whole bleakness of it, before that, another thing about it kind of being a bit self-referential is the different sort of King references, which they're really starting to do with the newer movies, and obviously the books did. Like when they're at the birthday party and you can hear Judd in the background talking about Cujo. I'm pretty sure there was a sign in there that had like dairy on it. And then there was one that I'm assuming is intentional, but I'm not quite sure, which is when Gage is screaming, when he sees Victor in the corner and he's like screaming his name. When him screaming his name sound with the rhythm of it and everything, sounds a lot like Danny screaming Red Rum. I'm going to assume that's not an accident. So you can tell with that stuff in there also. But as far as the bleakness goes, one thing that I didn't quite like at all, actually I didn't like at all, in the original movie was the way it used the grief angle. Because a big part of the story of Pet Sematary is the whole grieving going into horror thing. So you have to have like the real connections with this family and really feel like the tragedy of the deaths in it. because of how much that's going to affect the characters when the horror is taking place and how they're both like a part of each other, the grief and the horror of it. Um, as like obviously the most recent example of this is something like Hereditary, does this practically flawlessly. And this is obviously going to be the same thing, but the thing that I didn't like about it in the original was that instead of feeling like, a genuine portrayal of grief, it sort of felt more like it was just basking in the unpleasantness of it. Like for the sake of shock value is what it felt like, as opposed to being like, genuine emotion that's going to drive the horror when it comes. It just felt really. I just don't like it the way it's portrayed in the original movie at all. And so here, the problem is that I don't think they do it enough. Like there's the whole thing, like the connection between Ellie and Church, like the closeness, like her and the closeness of the cat, aren't really near as apparent here. Like you have the whole scene in the original movie where she's like panicking about the idea of Church dying. Like she asks him like why do pets die so much sooner than humans? But there's like a much more emotional thing in the original version when she's like petrified of the idea that Church will die eventually, and that closeness of how it's my cat and God can't have him and stuff like that. And it's like this really emotional thing, and he like sleeps under the blanket with her and all that. We really don't get any of that in this one. It's just like it's her cat. She likes her cat, but then by the time they establish any of this, he's already dead. So like when they have to hide the cat, we don't really feel it near as much as I have to do something so incredibly drastic to prevent her from knowing that he's dead, like this, and setting off this whole chain of events. The feeling, it just really isn't there because they don't really spend enough time on it. And it's kind of the same way with the family too. I mean, like they tickle each other in bed once. That's about as close as they get in regards to, hey, look how happy they are genuinely. It feels much more like the old movie rule of we have to show you them being happy because shit's gonna get fucked up later, and that's it. That's all it's here for. So the genuine emotion really isn't there much at all in this one. So that's kind of missing, which sucks because you have so much better actors in this one. You'd think it would come through, but like it's almost like it's like it happens in fast forward, the emotional parts of this one. So it's not quite there, and it's in a pretty big hurry to get to the horror angle, much more so than the other one was, which is really weird to say given all the really campy shit that happens in that one. Yeah, but as far as this one goes, there wasn't real, and I don't know if this is because we all know the story so well at this point, but there was a lack of like genuine creepiness here for the most part. Like, and some of the shots that actually genuinely creeped me out were for reasons that I'm not quite sure why. Like when they're at the birthday party and she sees Church coming down the road. It's like we do get a closer shot of him, but for some reason it was that distant shot of him where we saw like his tail in the air coming. I don't know why, but that just freaked me the fuck out. I don't know why. But yeah, and then of course talking about the big change that happened, the spoilery big change if somehow you were able to avoid that information. The fact that Ellie is the one that is killed in the crash and brought back, instead of Gage. And the thing here is that I actually feel like they could have done a little more with this, and the movie would have been creepier for it. These moments where, like, Jason Clarke is alone in the house with her, and he, like, tucks her in, and you can see, like, her eyes are going in, like, two different directions, and then the whole, dancing thing the following morning. Stuff like that, where he's, like, basically trying to live with her even though she's so clearly different and more sinister. That whole thing was like super creepy and something that I could have they probably could have basked in a little more. But for the most part, like I said, it kind of takes away from the creepiness when you know the ins and outs of the story so well and all that. Even if they do play with like gore a little more than they probably could have, like when we see Victor on the table after the crash, and we can actually see like his bones and like his brain pulsating. But that just feels more like, hey, we have the effects to do this now, so we're just going to do that. But it doesn't really add much to anything except a quease thing. But this is a movie that should definitely be relying more on the creepiness than stuff like that. But it's not. I mean, it's not like it's a movie that lingers on gore or anything. But I felt like the whole Victor thing, like with the brain, was a little excessive. So, so there's that. And I mean, obviously that's in the original also, but they didn't quite have the effects that we do now that could make the brain fucking pulsate in his head while he's still alive. But, whatever floats your boat. So that's pretty much what that is. There is one thing that I was kind of hoping they would do in this one that they didn't do in the original. That's something I kind of always wished that they did in regards to making another creepy factor to it and kind of making it seem a bit more, to everything feel a bit more supernatural in like an out of control way. And that was not showing the truck drivers. Like if you made them more like the truck in Duel, where it was just like these, sort of faceless trucks maybe giving you, if you have to bring up maximum overdrive, I guess you can. If you absolutely have to, but just the way, like, the trucks are just constantly speeding down the road in this way that seems like so unnatural. When we get like full-on shots of just regular dudes behind the wheel in the original movie, and we get like one, relatively quick shot of just a regular dude driving it when the crash happens, but I feel like just, like I said, there's just something so supernatural about the way they appear and disappear so quickly. And you kind of take away from the creepiness factor there by actually showing, the people inside. I think it would have been creepier if it was just, darkened windows, but maybe that's just me. So I like the way it, plays with the expectations and has fun with itself, but like I said, it more or less is the same movie and doesn't have near the creepiness factor it probably should overall. It's definitely in there in snippets, but not necessarily overall. And then, like I said, the whole grieving angle and the family angle could have been significantly stronger. So, but it doesn't feel near as, campy as the original, so it's got that going for it. And, and I don't hate the ending. I'm sure some people probably will. And the fact that it's like we do technically have 3 different endings where we have the book's ending, and then the 89 movie's ending takes the ending of the book like just 10 seconds longer and changes it a little bit. Gives it a bit more of a certainty what exactly happens, and then this one's a new ending entirely. So, I do appreciate like what the ideas they had, what they changed, and how they were able to do the stuff that we know is coming to an effective enough degree, but it still feels like there's something missing a little bit, but it's fine for sure. And obviously the critics, interestingly enough, have taken to it, so it's got that going for it, but I think it's okay. So I guess I'll leave that at that. The next thing is going to be The Beach Bum, which, as somebody that really, really loved Spring Breakers, I was looking forward to for quite a while. And it's kind of just ended up being something that's a little bit Spring Breakers light, I guess you could say. Despite having a really interesting cast list, very sort of diverse cast list on top of McConaughey being the star of it in a role that apparently Gary Oldman had to turn down before it got to McConaughey, despite the fact that it seems like it's pretty much McConaughey incarnate, which is interesting. And you can tell just by the setting alone that it basically sort of, intentional or not, basically feels like a sort of companion piece to Spring Breakers, despite the fact that Korean movies do have just sort of this particular style of being these more or less plotless movies about people that just mainly I was gonna say degenerate lifestyles, but I suppose that's close enough. That just kind of go about their lives and maybe something happens or nothing happens, but it doesn't really matter either way. So as far as that goes, this character, Moondog, that is the center of it, basically, like I was saying, I really don't know how it was offered to anybody other than McConaughey, especially with how much his real personality seems to be coming through, which I'm assuming kind of came through as the character was being created during the making, considering a lot of this feels like heavily improv. I don't know if that's actually the case, but I'd be shocked if it wasn't. Um, and much like Spring Breakers, I did witness a few walkouts quite early. We're talking like maybe 15 minutes in early, if that. And I can get that. Like, just as much as I love Spring Breakers, I can get it for that too. But yeah, it's because, especially here though, because as far as the first half goes, it is like basically Harmony Korine kind of under the supervision of Terrence Malick is what it feels like. Especially with a number of scenes basically feeling like impromptu music videos, more or less. Some songs playing like all the way through in their entirety during montages, particularly with the scenes between McConaughey and Isla Fisher. And it's basically him interacting with these various characters. Like in the first half, there's Snoop Dogg, who's like basically his best friend, I guess you could say, who is named Ray, which is short for lingerie. And then there's Isla Fisher, who is his wife, who is prone to public sexual encounters, among many other things. There's Jimmy Buffett playing himself, and Jonah Hill as his agent of sorts, with a heavy southern accent kind of thing. I guess I turn childish when Jonah Hill's around, because it's like, all with Jonah Hill, all it really takes is him doing another voice, and I just think it's the funniest fucking thing ever. And this is no different from that. But then there is, after tragedy strikes Moondog's life, it kind of just continues to still be his life anyway, because that's the kind of person that he is. He just runs into other different characters that we haven't yet met, like Zac Efron, who he meets in rehab, who... according to something that I read, his facial hair actually, it doesn't just look like it actually is based on the fact that Harmony Korine was staring at a panini sandwich when he got the idea for this look. And then there's Martin Lawrence as a dude that gives dolphin tours that go awry very quickly. And that's one of those cases where, when I saw Martin Lawrence here, apparently this is his first movie since the Death at a Funeral remake, which was 9 years ago. And there was, Big Mom's House 3 was after that, so it was 8 years ago since he's actually done a movie. And then he's got Bad Boys 3 next year, but here I was wondering, like, what is it going to be like to see Martin Lawrence in a Harmony Korine movie? And the answer to that question is a little bit disappointing, and the answer to that question is basically that when Martin Lawrence is on screen, Harmony Korine is making a Martin Lawrence movie. And they kind of switch, but everything else is him from beginning to end, up to and including even... Not that it necessarily feels like Wes Anderson or anything, but there is a brief period where Moondog's just hanging out with a guy that for some reason is dressed like Steve Zissou, so there is that too. And then that's basically all we have. It's a Harmony Korine movie, and that's really all you need to know. If you're familiar with him, you know exactly what you're getting into. And I don't know if that's a problem or not, because the one interesting thing about it is the fact that McConaughey's kind of found himself back in this area where he's basically doing like some of the most experimental shit he can find on top of this, and say what you will about it, it seems that Serenity is already starting to get a reputation of being this really fascinating mess that actually might be worth looking at from an entirely different standpoint other than it's a weird-ass movie. Because it's like just its very existence proves some kind of risk factor that's worth looking into, and the actors that are actually willing to take leaps like that. And the fact that McConaughey would do this and Serenity, like one right after the other, regardless of them failing at the box office, I don't really think that's what he's in it for, despite the fact that, news sites are really trying to make a big deal out of that. Despite the fact that Spring Breakers did decent business for the kind of movie that it is, I don't know that this is going to be as, attractive to people that wouldn't normally watch movies like this, unless they're like huge like McConaughey fans, I guess. Especially since it's really up to McConaughey to make this character likable, and I don't know that he got there for me entirely, because he's one of those characters that, and I mean, this is where the fact that he does work for a lot of people proves the talent that he put into this, and the fact that he didn't just sleepwalk through it, didn't just use his real personality and that was it. Because the problem here is that this is that guy that can be really frustrating also. He's that guy that you can somewhat relate to, probably somebody you know or at least once knew, that is never reliable and is like, you know, frustratingly selfish to an extent. And basically the guy that no matter where he is would rather be at the next thing, and it's this endless chain for him. But when he is there and when you can get him in place, it's a party and you want him around. And he basically has to be that guy while also being likable enough that we stick with him throughout this, because it does get really repetitive after a while, and not necessarily in the good sense, because I've talked before about the cycle that is the first half of Spring Breakers, where the whole point is it's the same thing over and over again, and it kind of gets redundant. Up to it's what they thought they wanted, and then by the time they've done it over and over again, they need something new, and then when Franco comes in, that's when it's the movie's jumping off point. This is like that, but in reverse. It's like he's really looking for this area, and once he gets there, then it's just the endless cycle of it over and over and over again, just until it ends, until it finds a stopping point. And despite the fact that it does come to life when he runs into all these different colorful characters, played by actors that seemingly are cast from out of nowhere, there is something interesting in watching that, but like I said, it all comes back to the center being this McConaughey character that I personally had trouble latching onto. And like I said, to an extent, I'm sure that's his purpose, but at the same time, he does have to kind of hook you in a certain way if you're going to get all the way through and just be really immersed in it, and I didn't really get that far in it. It's also kind of, it's easy to compare him to, like, you know, The Dude, probably, where it's this sort of Odyssey where he just goes through, and his personality, not just is he a stoner, but his personality, like, doesn't really change, and that's kind of the point, as he goes through and meets all these different, you know, characters that are just way over the top and come from totally different worlds than him, but it's just him sort of going in their worlds and then back out again to another one, and just the endless chain until I don't know that I can say the movie reaches a stopping point. It just kind of gets to a certain point and then it's just done. He just kind of floats off. So it's, yeah. So I mean, it is technically what you're expecting, but it doesn't seem quite as like skillful or like quietly profound in ways like Spring Breakers or Kids is. I know Gummo has a lot of fans also, so even Julian Donkey Boy, if you want to go there. It doesn't really have something like those movies do, at least the first time around. But that's the thing is with the movies like that, with the others that I mentioned that Corinne's done, you kind of crave that revisitation and those characters. Moondog's a character that I'm not really, like, I don't have that urge to revisit anytime soon, so, yeah, so I like, you know, the whole idea behind it, and all the different characters in it, and the settings, and the way they're shot, and just that sort of, the way, like, the days go into nights, and the nights go into days, and all that, but it does get pretty tiresome, which is something that doesn't typically happen for me in regards to stuff that Harmony Korine's made. So that's pretty much where I land with this. I really wish I liked it a lot more, but it's just kind of much like its main character. It's just kind of here. So that's pretty much all there is to that. Let's go on to Unicorn Store, a movie that I almost forgot existed, and that's mainly because I think that it had a run at TIFF like almost 2 years ago, and they decided, oh, well, since Captain Marvel's out, might as well put out this movie that stars Brie Larson and Samuel L. Jackson together. This will be when it gets the most attention, and on Netflix, no less. So, yeah, and it's also the directorial debut of Brie Larson, and this is basically, I mean, even you can tell it's already like out of its time because it's coming out like almost 2 years later. But I mean, even more than that, you remember the overly quirky indie movie that was like, that kind of has its moments of popularity, but for the most part seemed to have kind of fallen off the map. At least not as, it's not as big in the way it used to be, and as annoyingly constant as it seemed to used to be. Well, this basically would fit in with those. Just knowing the plot of this girl that basically didn't get over her love of like rainbows and glitter and unicorns, and tries to put that into her art in the more like adult world, and just kind of that refusal to grow out of it, which obviously there is something here in regards to like basically, it seems to have this message where it's like, you do need to grow up at some point, but at the same time, don't be afraid to be artistic in your own way. But this movie has a really weird way of conveying whatever it is it's trying to say. To Larson's credit, she didn't write it. There was... I'm not even sure how she got the directing job on this. Apparently, I guess she came across the script and it like really spoke to her, so this is what she chose to make her directorial debut. What would have been shortly after, like right after her Oscar win. So, and it begins with what appear to be real home movies of her, as she kind of grows up, but also kind of stays in line with this, to the point that she's still wearing the same getup, only one that now fits her as an adult, when she was like 7, as she's painting glittery rainbows and unicorns or whatever the hell. And she's stuck living with her parents, who are Bradley Whitford and Joan Cusack. It does have a really interesting cast, this movie, with actors that can really do great things even with very little. But everybody's just kind of here, with the exception of Larson pretty much, and Jackson to an extent. And it's to the point that she's so weird, as it were. She even gets scolded at the dinner table by Joan Cusack, who literally says the words, "Stop it, you're being weird on purpose." As if she's done this before, and it's like her thing. But the trouble with this is that the plot kicks off with her deciding to put on one of her mom's old suits and go to this job. And there's something off about this immediately that sort of feels like, when she goes off to work, it kind of feels like it's the start of Being John Malkovich or Sorry to Bother You. Like, you just kind of know it's going to get a little weird. But maybe not to the extent of those movies, especially since this is a... I don't know if it has like an official rating, but it's pretty much like a PG movie. But the thing about that is that this character seems to have this drastic turn that kind of comes from out of nowhere. At least doesn't... It feels weird, because it's like an overnight thing where when she's come home after she's been kicked out of the art thing for doing her rainbow thing, and she seems like that character that like really dreads being back home and is like just hates everything and is tired of everything and feels like everything's being forced on her. But then just like overnight when she gets this job, she's like this constant happy character, which is basically supposed to be like obviously shown through the art that she puts together. Like she's supposed to be Sally Hawkins and Happy Go Lucky or something. But it just, like I said, it just seems like an overnight thing, and it really does not feel like the character it was in the first 10 minutes when she decides, okay, I'm going to go to this job, and then she's that character for the rest of the movie. It's not like a plot thing where she did change overnight. It's just like the script decided to change her overnight, and it's really weird from then on, because then she's like, the whole point is that she's like way overly naive and happy about whatever, like the more childish dreams that she once had and still has. So, to her credit, weirdly enough, she somehow finds a way to play that character, but for the most part, not all the time, but for the most part, refrains from it being like an overly cutesy performance from like beginning to end. That shit's in there, obviously, but it's not like the entire thing like you might expect it to be given that description. But even so, there's still shit in there like the overly quirky shit or the overly cutesy shit, where like she gets called into the office and the two women are walking, and Larson goes like this way around like a pole or a pillar that's there. And she's like, oh, you can come this way, or you can go that way if you want to. And Larson just decides to take that way because it's different, I guess. And it's like, God. So, just little things like that are in there that will drive you insane if you hate this kind of shit. But, I mean, for the most part, it just kind of gets weirder as it goes. And it's like, that's like the least of our problems, is little shit like that. When she meets Samuel Jackson, who's in this really bizarre place that only he inhabits, that's basically what appears to be like this unicorn, happy, somewhat dungeon of sorts, but has like its own ice cream parlor, and it's got all the shit that she loves, like the pink stuffed animals, and he wears like Willy Wonka suits, and everything is happy here. He rides around on a scooter and shit, and says that this isn't just a store, it's a unicorn store, and the only thing he sells is unicorns, as long as his buyers earn them. So she's basically got to put her life back together, and Samuel Jackson will give her a unicorn, which is her big dream. So a lot of the movie is wondering if, number one, this is just some elaborate hoax that she's fallen into, if Jackson's legit about this or not, or if Larson is totally insane and she's too naive, or if Jackson even exists at all. The movie doesn't necessarily focus on this, like it's up to you to do that, because it focuses more on like her relationship with the Virgil dude that she meets at the store, where she's trying to get him to build the stable for the unicorn, which is one on the list of things she has to do if she's gonna get one. And then her dealing with her family, with Bradley Whitford and Joan Cusack, who are kind of forcing this other dorky dude on her that she grew up with. And then there's her whole job, where she has to like convincingly sell a vacuum cleaner, and there's not a lot here. The movie's runtime is it's about an hour and a half, and it kind of strains to even reach that. So they shoehorn in stuff that's like, you know, current, like her boss, who is Hamish Linklater, who's like really weirdly sort of touchy, in like the whole sexual harassment sort of way. Trouble is this doesn't really go anywhere. It's just kind of in there and has a weird character. And like I said, I guess to say something about, you know, something relevant, but it's just in there and has almost nothing to do with anything. So especially in the long run, so it's just in there. And then the whole thing with Virgil, her friend or boyfriend, it's too PG to go into it one way or the other. But the thing about this is that this happens really quickly. Like, when the very first time he meets her, he seems like really put off by her and like her general weirdness. But then by the next scene, he's like totally game for whatever the hell it is that she's about and wherever it takes him. And it just seems really sudden, and like but once again though, it doesn't really go that far. Basically, it just ends up being he's the one that puts up with her weirdness the most, even though there's really nothing on screen that shows why he might be driven to do this. Because his change in character is more like you can see a script working as opposed to it feels like a genuine relationship between the two. But you can tell they're really trying, and the dude is charming enough, but the writing's just kind of really, really lazy about it. So, yeah, that's pretty much all that it is. And it's relatively predictable directions in regards to at least the people directly in her life. Like Virgil and her parents and all that. But then there's the stuff like what is Jackson and where is that unicorn thing gonna go? Is it real or is it not? Is she insane or is he scamming her or what? But it does come to like a very rushed conclusion. It tries to fit all that in at once, but it seems to actually go towards the whole. It's much more literal than it sets itself up as. Like, it almost seems like it could be an allegory in some way or metaphorical in another way, but it's in just how literal it is, it abandons a lot. Like, it kind of somewhat wraps something up and it kind of somewhat touches on this, but once it starts to go in one direction, it just stops. So, I don't, so there's really not a whole lot to say about it apart from that. Like I said, Larson is fine acting-wise. It's just the character feels really off and really, really underdeveloped in regards to what exactly it is she wants to accomplish, and when she does finally reach, where she feels she needs to be by the end, it doesn't feel like there was any work in her getting here. It's just kind of like, well, this is the part in the story where she gets to this point and figures this out and decides this. The end. Nothing feels like it naturally progresses. It just happens, and then it's by the time you have so many questions, it's just over. So, like I said, if you're like really want to see like what Larson does as a director, or if you're just a big fan of hers in general, or the chemistry between her and Jackson that we've seen before, this being their third movie after Captain Marvel and Kong, there's clearly something between them, but yeah, that's like the least of the movie, at least physically when they have scenes together. But so yeah, it's pretty easy to see why they didn't know what to do with it for a couple of years, so it just kind of sat around. But it's tolerable, I guess, unless you're like really not into the whole quirky for the sake of it thing. Which maybe since we're not quite in an era of it anymore, maybe it'll be easier to put up with than it might have been at one point. But it still is what it is. So that's all there really is to that. So we'll go to something totally and completely entirely different with Dragged Across Concrete, the movie I've been trying to get to for like 2 weeks now. Because S. Craig Zoller is not a director that I typically get hyped about. Because when I talked about this a lot with Brawl and Cell Block 99 last year, I think last year, yeah, about a year or a year and a half ago. And it started when Bone Tomahawk got enthusiastically recommended to me by a shitload of people. And it totally seemed like my thing. And I did like Bone Tomahawk, but it was very, what we would learn to be, it's very Zoller. So, and it depends on you. He's really, really growing a fan base here, a really passionate fan base too. And he's certainly, kind of developing a certain style. It's just a matter of how you take to in what ways he's building his own style. Because, to start off with, one of the things that seems to be getting brought up a lot, particularly with Dragged Across Concrete, is the political standpoint, and where Zoller stands on that. Given that his characters in this movie are like racist and they hate the PC world and they want to get back to a certain way and they think the world's going to hell with, you know, whatever, like, as far as, like, you know, progressive or whatever goes, and the thing about that is that it's a little weird to me to get totally hung up on whether or not Zoller himself feels that way. Like, if you're having a discussion about his entire body of work, I would see that, but if you're just strictly talking about one movie, it's a weird thing, I think, to get hung up on, because it's like, what really matters is if the characters are portrayed that way. All that should really matter in regards to that is, do you believe that the characters, if that's the way they are and that's what they stand for or believe in or whatever. And it's like, it's kind of irrelevant if that's what it is, unless you're like really, really, really opposed to some message he may or may not be trying to put out there. I do think he cops out a lot when you hear him say, like, I mean, obviously, a lot of directors say they don't like to discuss the themes of their movie or what everything means, because then it would sort of lose something, or he could also mean he just doesn't want to get into all that because of whatever. But in this particular case, to me, it just kind of seems like it doesn't matter, and if the characters are believably that way, but they also find a way to make you care about them, or at least be fascinated enough with them that you want to see what happens to them and how they get from point A to point B or whatever. I think that's all that really matters when you're looking at it from strictly one standalone movie. So that's not really a standpoint I thought about going into this. And I know a lot of people think it's touchy and a bit, you know, I guess on the edgy side to cast Mel Gibson as a racist character, given what he's gotten in trouble for in the past, and the whole movie's trying to say something about that or something. But it's really, it's a character, and he's an actor, so that's really, I mean, like I said, though, if you were, like, really going deep into it, it might be another story, but as far as the movie itself, these are the characters. And as far as the story being he and Vince Vaughn are the cops that get caught on camera assaulting a guy and being racist and all that, and they get suspended without pay by Don Johnson. This scene where they have the whole PC conversation. And I guess another way the whole political thing is relevant is if you feel like you're being beat over the head with it by the writer. That can be grating and kind of take away from, you know, any other focus you may have on the movie. But yeah, for the most part, it just felt like it was within the characters. The reason I bring up the plot is the fact that something that Zoller did that I had a lot of complaints about with Brawl and Cell 99 is that, and to an extent, Bone Tomahawk, the fact that the length of his movies being one of the things about his reputation and his sort of recognizable style, if you want to call it that. Now, while I do have a lot of criticisms about that, there are two things that go the other direction. Number one, I did have, if I remember correctly, a lengthy defense of long run times, regardless of how you feel about the movie, when I talked about Brawl and Cell 99, where it's like, because there's no, like, there's, like, no one way to write a movie. You can't say, like, because your story has this plot, you can only make it this long. That's just not the way it works. It's like, he can take a story that you could write, like, on a fraction of a post-it note and make it 3.5 hours if he was artistically inclined to. But the problem here is that whether or not it warrants it is a whole other issue. Or the way that, like, whether or not he would be able to drag it out in that sense and make it seem like it's worth it without just dragging on, without just being indulgent or whatever. And I didn't see it at all. Brawl and Cell 99's length just baffles me to no end. But the thing about Dragged Across Concrete is it's like 20 minutes longer, but doesn't feel its length. Let me just say this right up front. I am not crazy about Dragged Across Concrete. It's not a movie I particularly really like, and it's not a movie that I would recommend. But one thing I can say about it is it's 2 hours and 40 minutes long and does not feel like it. And that can't go unnoticed. I but still, when you look at that, you have stuff like obviously a large portion of the movie is a stakeout. So there's going to be really long scenes of just Gibson and Vaughn in a car staking this building out. And a lot of it feels like it's happening like in real time. So we've got stuff like Gibson telling Vaughn a bunch of stuff we already know about his backstory and what's going on in his life. We've got this now infamous scene of Vince Vaughn eating a sandwich in real time. Not too dissimilar from Rooney Mara eating the pie in A Ghost Story. Where in A Ghost Story it was more like an emotional like progression with her. Whereas in Dragged Across Concrete with the sandwich and Vince Vaughn, it feels like it's just for shits and giggles, more or less. And I could see, like, it could be one of those scenes where if you see it with if you're looking to see it with a crowd instead of on VOD or something, it's the kind of scene that would get, like, the gradually building laughter through a crowd. Like, the longer it goes, like, the more weirdly humorous it gets. So, like, I mean, I don't, like, hate that it's in there, but I just can't help but also think of what would be lost if it was cut. Nothing. Nothing at all. And you've also got stuff like some of the repetitive dialogue, like the anchovies thing, that he just seemed really, Zoller seemed really proud of for some reason. But there's also the other scenes in regards, because the whole storyline is this, you know, crime thing, the staking it out and then basically interrupting this crime and getting it for themselves. But obviously you do need to care about your character, so there's going to be a lot of time devoted to that. But the trouble with the way it's done here is that to me it felt a little too much like, not so much these scenes are making me care about the characters, but acknowledging these are the scenes where I'm supposed to care about the characters. Like, we get these moments with them where we see them with their family, or their girlfriends, or their little brothers and their mothers and all that, and it's like, I get why these scenes are here, but I'm not feeling it. So they're just there, and they don't do anything to particularly rise above that, and give themselves more purpose than just, hey, this is the part where we care about the characters so that should something inevitably bad happen, or at least suspenseful happen, there's something to care about. And it's not even so much that I disliked the characters because of actions they did earlier in the movie. It was just these scenes are so flat, especially the scenes with Gibson's wife, where her dialogue is basically just to, like, flatly explain shit. And it's like the dialogue and the delivery just felt really unnatural. There's the whole storyline where his daughter's getting, like, harassed, where it's like, I guess they're trying to give us a little sliver of why he's as racist as he is with that storyline, but it's already been, like, well established by that point, and it just all feels like there's just so much here that we get, and we would still get if it wasn't here. And because of that, and like I said, I hate to take away from, you know, being that guy that says you really need to cut all this down because you don't need to make a 2 hour and 40-minute movie with this paper-thin-ass plot you've got. Because there's so much you can do with a runtime, no matter what the main plot line is, especially character work. But this is like, looking back on it, I want to relish in that stuff. I want to love the scene where Vaughn eats a sandwich in real time. But looking back on it, all I see is, like, a few scenes that really stand out and just fucking dead air in between. And that's in retrospect. I watched this, like, a few days ago, and this is the way that it's aged. And it's like, I remember the suspenseful scenes and a character scene here and there, but it's like, I feel like I remember about half an hour of a movie that's 2 hours and 40 minutes. And like I said, and the baffling thing is that the movie doesn't feel its length. Which, like I said, is a compliment that I can't give enough. But the content of the movie, though, there's just so much. And then there's the whole thing about the way he uses his violence and how, like, really graphic and sometimes way over the top it is. Where like obviously Bone Tomahawk has a couple of really famous scenes of gore. Then there's all the shit in Brawl and Cell 99 where he was supposedly going for the exploitation thing. And now in this, it seems like there's trying to be a bit more of a realism to it. All the way down to the raspy way people breathe when they've been shot. But there's like one particular really gruesome scene, and then one scene towards like the end of the middle, that just sort of feels like shock value, because it's like this whole thing where there actually could be a number of things, because there's also a lot of controversy with the way Zoller handles his female characters, but this scene particularly in the middle felt more like like on the surface it seems like a classic example of making sure your audience knows that nobody's off limits. So you go through the whole introduction of a character and you make them about as sympathetic as you can possibly make them, and then just snuff them out like that in the most brutal way that you can think of on screen. And yeah, and as a classic case of show the audience that anybody's expendable, I guess I get it. But I mean, given just how much backstory we got for this character whose sole purpose is to die graphically, it just felt like cheap shock value. And also the fact that we're really living in a time now where killing off major characters, I guess if you watch enough movies, but if killing off major characters just isn't a surprise the way it once was. And it's like that whole shock is just kind of a long gone thing now. And it's especially in movies like this, and especially from writers and directors like Zoller, who clearly have that stance of, have a history of doing such a thing. It's just like, instead of like when you see, you know, characters getting killed off that like in another movie you'd never suspect would, and you see like this really, really graphic scene of violence, it's like it loses its impact when you just expect that from the director. Because and the fact that this is only like the third movie in the lineup here, of these three, it's kind of alarming how quickly you can already put together what exactly he's gonna do based on two other movies. And it's like he's kind of hitting the same shock beats, and the impact just isn't there. Which leaves the movie already feels extremely hollow as it is, but to throw that on top of it, and to throw in the scenes where we care about them that just don't land at all, just feel really flat, just the whole thing, all 2 hours and 40 minutes, just feels so empty and pointless, and yeah, so I just really couldn't, like, I mean, I tried, and there are moments, obviously, that stand out, where, like, there are genuinely suspenseful scenes, but there's even moments where I was talking about the scenes where, like, we get to care about the characters by meeting the people in their family or their life or whatever. It hinders it even more because there's a nice suspenseful scene towards the end that's been going on for quite some time, and they just interrupt it right in the middle, just cut it right off for one quick scene with Vaughn's girlfriend, just to cut right back to it. And you've just broken that tension like in half for a scene that we really didn't even need to see, because very soon after we'd get the payoff for it, but we already saw a setup to it. We did not need to see her come home. Everything was set up with that already, without that scene in period, let alone interrupting this scene at the end that should have been one long-ass tension-building scene. So yeah, so when it wasn't just not doing its job, it was hindering the movie itself, seemingly actively. So I don't know. But, you know, apparently I'm talking to hear myself, because, not that this would ever get back to him anyway, but, so I can say whatever the hell I want. But it's, this whole thing of Zoller, I saw a headline where Zoller said, like, he doesn't care how you feel about his movies. He doesn't care what you think about his movies. And it's like, well, that really shows, and I don't know if that's a good thing or not. I get where that sentiment is coming from, for sure, obviously, but, you know, it's... I don't know. I really wish I could get into him, but so far, it's mostly misses, unfortunately. So that sucks. I'm really trying. I really am. But as of right now, I just think he's really not my thing, which is unfortunate. So that's where I stand with that. Let's end on The Highwaymen. Another movie with a very, very simple plot that is about 2 hours and 12 minutes. Everything's so long, but this one also carries itself pretty well, also. So it's an intriguing concept as it is, with Kevin Costner and Woody Harrelson playing the Texas Rangers that tracked down Bonnie and Clyde and eventually led to the ambush that killed them. And it's just the lead into that after they sort of come out of a retirement or semi-retirement or wherever it was they were. And this is definitely something that's more like... When you say character-driven, you probably imagine something more along the lines of like an ensemble thing or something, but it is character-driven, but it's really mainly just the focus of the two of them. Because you got characters like Kathy Bates, who seem like interesting characters, but is in it so little I kept forgetting she was in it until she showed back up or somebody mentioned her. But the interesting thing they do in regards to avoiding like showing characters or getting too far into them is that this movie is well aware of the fact that we've gotten the Bonnie and Clyde story, we've gotten the anti-hero story. So this movie is going to help portray them as villains by just hardly showing them at all and having them strictly live through their actions until we're face to face with them at the last moment. And we do see them committing certain crimes and killing people, but their faces are either like obscured or seen from a distance, or the scene is shot in a certain way where we don't get a very good look at them until like at the very last second, the last seconds that they're alive. Which I thought was a really cool touch and a really cool way to show that off, especially since, you know, so many movies have, like, you know, glorified them the way they were. And the glorification is shown in this movie also through their fan base. And it's easily, like, the most disturbing aspect of the movie. That's often missing from other Bonnie and Clyde stories that we've seen. Where we see just the way people flocked to them and treated them like they were, you know, like, basically reality stars of today or something. Especially that scene, like, at the very end is just, like, a level of disturbing I didn't expect from a movie by this director. This is the guy that directed, like, The Blind Side, among other things. And it's also one of those cases where when you have a director like him, you can imagine, like, maybe the movie is not quite as hard-hitting as it could be. I mean, it does have, like, you know, R-rated violence in it and all that, but it does also feel very, I guess, almost simple to a fault, even though the simplicity is also kind of what works about it. It's kind of hard to decipher, but like I said, the main thing here is the interactions between Costner and Harrelson throughout it, and watching these characters is really... the most appealing thing, because because once again, it's one of those movies where we know exactly how it ends already, because we've seen that ending many times, let alone know what it is. So it's a matter of what the movie can bring from these characters' perspectives that we haven't seen before. The Costner character is depicted in Bonnie and Clyde, the 1967 movie, but here we really kind of get... And obviously, I've heard that there's both a lot of accuracies and inaccuracies, but the accuracies are apparently, like, really impressive. I wish I knew more about that to comment more on that, but I'm glad to hear that that's at least half and half the case, and, like, a certain attention to detail. But there are also other characters in here that are thrown in relatively briefly, but have some interesting moments, especially when it's where the Costner Harrelson characters stand in regards to them. Like the Thomas Mann character that comes in as somebody that can identify them because he, like, knows them personally, but he also works for the cops, more or less, so it's like the Costner has to scold him and say, you know, they aren't the people that you think they are, and it's like, if if push comes to shove, you've got to see them for who they really are and act accordingly. And it can't be, the nice waitress that you saw that day that Bonnie once was, because now she's this killing machine. So to see it through that character is really interesting. And then there's one somewhat long scene in the middle that's really nice between Costner and William Sadler, and William Sadler is playing Clyde's dad, and he's basically playing him as a guy that like knows the outcome this has to have, and knows that it's trying to convince Costner that even though he knows how this needs to come out, he needs Costner to know that Clyde wasn't born that way, and that it was basically the direction the cops took his life that made him that way, or something. Um, but even though that's not necessarily probably a completely agreeable stance, he does make the character like really sympathetic to see him as the guy that spawned Clyde, and we know what Clyde has been capable of throughout this. And then there's like Woody Harrelson's interaction with like the guys at the bar and all that, and people who like treat Clyde like a king and work against the cops and all that. So yeah, it's basically all about the character interactions throughout. It's another one of those movies where like the individual scenes are much stronger than like the whole, because it's like you're just kind of waiting for those scenes. There's also a really nice chase scene, maybe not as good as the one in the '67 movie, but decent enough if short-lived, and is attention grabbing. But that is basically this movie, though, is it'll have those lulls in it for sure, especially with its length. But then there's kind of always that scene around the corner that will grab your attention. There's also Woody Harrelson gets a monologue that kind of shows where he's coming from, and the whole sort of foreshadowing exactly the fact that we know how the ambush goes, and establishing the fact that this will not be their first time in a scenario like this, but how it's affected them before. And that's a really interesting thing to know before they go into that. And then when it gets to the whole fame aspect, like the way they have, like, just the contempt for it, and the way things have changed since they were in their prime doing this. Like, just little moments like how the Woody Harrelson character is, like, so, like, stunned by the concept of wiretapping, and how easy it is to get certain information through means like that. So it's like just those little individual things that make the movie interesting throughout, even if it's a movie that maybe doesn't hold together as one big thing. But they make it worth watching in those individual scenes, with every now and then a recognizable actor that can really just, bring in one scene. Yeah, it really does work in regards to that kind of thing. So, and yeah, and just learning like the toll all this takes on them, and like the whole idea of how young Bonnie and Clyde are, and how much that kind of fucks with their heads too. Like when they actually go to the house and they see their clothes and just how small they look, and it just really sets in how you could get to that point, how these young people could become the Bonnie and Clyde that are killing cops and people left and right for very little sums of money at gas stations. And not necessarily being the Robin Hoods they claim to be in the media and all that got them the weird-ass obsessive fan base that they have. A lot of what has to be mentally ill people, but yeah, so it does have some interesting things it explores, but at the same time it does feel very surface level about it. But it's still overall, it's for being 2 hours and 12 minutes, and for a movie that's more or less based around two characters realizing how old they are, it's surprisingly smooth. And it's like, watching it all the way through is not that difficult, believe it or not. So, that's pretty much where I stand with that. So, as I lose my voice, I think we're finally done for this, for today. And I'll have a shitload of verses coming, some of which are already done, some of which I just did before this. So, all of that. And I am tired of talking now, so that's it.